In the depths of the Russian state archives lies a collection of letters so scandalous, so devastating to the memory of one of history's most powerful rulers, that they've been kept hidden from the world for over 2 centuries. These aren't just love letters. They're confessions of a monarch who dared to love both men and women in an age when such desires could destroy empires. Tonight, we're about to expose the buried truth about Catherine the Great, a woman whose sexual appetites were as vast as the territories she conquered. But this isn't just about lust. This is about a human soul trapped between the suffocating demands of absolute power and the desperate need for authentic love. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about one of history's most celebrated rulers. Because Catherine the Great wasn't just great at expanding Russia. She was extraordinary at hiding the most dangerous secret a monarch could possess. Picture this: the most powerful woman in 18th century Europe, commanding armies of hundreds of thousands, controlling the fates of millions, yet secretly writing passionate letters to both her male lovers and her female confidants. Letters that reveal a tortured soul caught between duty and desire, between the throne and her heart. If you're ready to dive into the forbidden chambers of Imperial Russia, where power and passion collided in ways that could have toppled a dynasty, then subscribe now, because once you hear these secrets, there's no going back. But here's what historians don't want you to know. Catherine's greatest conquest wasn't territorial. It was emotional, and it involved both the handsome guards who protected her body and the mysterious court ladies who understood her soul in ways no man ever could. We're talking about a woman who publicly maintained the facade of heterosexual propriety while privately exploring desires that could have cost her everything. A monarch who understood that her sexuality was both her greatest source of power and her most dangerous vulnerability. The evidence has been there all along, hidden in plain sight within diplomatic correspondences, court memoirs, and personal diaries of those closest to her. Accounts of late-night visits to certain chambers, of gifts exchanged between the empress and ladies of her court that went far beyond royal protocol. Some historians have dismissed these accounts as gossip, as the jealous whispers of a court obsessed with scandal. But when you piece together the fragments, the timing of certain appointments, the sudden disappearances of court ladies who grew too close, the passionate intensity with which Catherine wrote about female friendship, a different picture emerges. The question isn't whether Catherine the Great was bisexual. The question is how she managed to satisfy her deepest desires while ruling the largest empire on earth. And more terrifyingly, who else knew her secret? And what did they do with that knowledge? Because later in this story, we'll uncover how a young German princess named Sophie transformed herself into Catherine the Great through a web of seduction that began long before she ever wore the Russian crown. Sophie Friederike Auguste was just 14 when she first tasted the intoxicating power of seduction. But this wasn't the innocent awakening of a sheltered princess. This was the calculated education of a future empress who would learn to weaponize desire itself. In the Prussian court where young Sophie grew up, she witnessed something that would shape her entire approach to love and power. Her own mother's strategic affairs, her father's calculated indifference, and the deadly dance of European nobility, where hearts were currency and bodies were battlefields. But Sophie possessed something her royal peers lacked, an insatiable curiosity that extended beyond politics into the realm of human intimacy. Court records reveal that even as a teenager, she formed unusually intense relationships with both male tutors and female companions, relationships that raised eyebrows among the more conservative members of German aristocracy. When the Russian envoys arrived to evaluate her as a potential bride for the future Peter III, they found a young woman of startling intelligence and disturbing magnetism. What they couldn't have known was that Sophie had already begun exploring the full spectrum of human attraction in ways that would have scandalized even the libertine courts of France. Her journey to Russia in 1744 wasn't just a political alliance. It was the migration of a sexual revolutionary who would transform an empire through the sheer force of her appetite for both power and pleasure. The 15-year-old princess who stepped off that carriage in Moscow carried within her a secret that would reshape the very nature of Imperial Russian sexuality. The conversion to Russian orthodoxy The adoption of the name Catherine, these weren't just political necessities. They were the first acts in a magnificent performance that would allow her to reinvent herself completely, to shed the constraints of German propriety and embrace the more fluid, more dangerous possibilities of Russian court life. But here's what makes Catherine's story truly extraordinary. She didn't just adapt to Russian culture, she began immediately identifying potential lovers and allies among both sexes. Court witnesses describe her unusual attention to the female servants, her lingering conversations with ladies-in-waiting that went far beyond protocol. Even more telling are the letters she wrote to her former German companions, letters that speak of loneliness and longing in terms that suggest relationships far more intimate than mere friendship. She describes missing the warmth of familiar embraces and the comfort only certain souls can provide. And then there were the men, guards, courtiers, diplomats, who fell under her spell with alarming frequency. But Catherine's attraction to these men wasn't conventional. She seemed drawn to those who possessed a certain sensitivity, an emotional intelligence that allowed them to understand her complex inner world. By the time she married the future Peter III in 1745, Catherine had already established herself as someone who refused to be confined by traditional expectations of royal sexuality. The wedding night itself would prove to be just the beginning of a marital arrangement that would give her unprecedented freedom to explore her true nature. But what happened in those first months of marriage would set the stage for the most explosive royal scandal in Russian history. A scandal involving not just adultery, but desires so complex and controversial that they threatened the very foundation of imperial legitimacy. The marriage between Catherine and Peter III was a disaster from the very first night. But what historians have failed to understand is that this wasn't just about political incompatibility. It was about a young woman discovering that her sexual needs were far more complex than any traditional marriage could satisfy. Peter III was emotionally immature, sexually inexperienced, and completely oblivious to his wife's psychological depth. While he played with toy soldiers in their shared chambers, Catherine was writing in her secret diary about dreams that would have shocked the Russian Orthodox Church to its very core. Those early diary entries, discovered centuries later hidden behind a false wall in the Winter Palace, reveal a woman grappling with attractions that defied every convention of her time. She wrote about the strange warmth she felt when certain ladies-in-waiting helped her dress, about dreams involving both masculine and feminine forms, about a longing for intimacy that transcended the rigid categories her world imposed. But Catherine was too intelligent to be destroyed by confusion. Instead, she began a careful campaign of sexual education, using the vast resources of the Imperial Library to study everything from ancient Greek philosophy to contemporary French libertine literature. She devoured accounts of Sappho, absorbed the writings of philosophers who questioned traditional gender roles, and began to understand that her desires weren't aberrations. They were simply human. The breakthrough came during her third year of marriage, when she formed her first documented intimate relationship with a woman. Countess Elizaveta Vorontsova wasn't just a lady-in-waiting. She was an intellectual equal who understood Catherine's frustrations with both her marriage and the limitations placed on royal women. Their relationship began as philosophical discussions that stretched late into the night, evolved into emotional intimacy that scandalized the court, and eventually became something that contemporary observers could only describe in careful euphemisms. Letters between them speak of sacred bonds and touches that heal the soul. But Catherine's genius lay in her ability to compartmentalize. While exploring this revolutionary relationship with Elizaveta, she simultaneously began her first extramarital affair with Sergei Saltykov, a charming court chamberlain who possessed the sensitivity and emotional intelligence that her husband completely lacked. What makes this period so psychologically fascinating is how Catherine managed to satisfy two entirely different aspects of her nature without allowing either relationship to compromise her political position. She was learning to navigate the treacherous waters of royal bisexuality with a sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. The physical evidence of these relationships exists in the architectural changes she made to her private apartments. Secret passages were constructed, hidden doors were installed, and certain chambers were redesigned to provide complete privacy for activities that went far beyond what any royal marriage typically encompassed. More tellingly, Catherine began developing a personal code language with her intimate partners, both male and female. Court observers noted her use of specific gestures, particular phrases, and symbolic gifts that seemed to communicate messages incomprehensible to outsiders. But the most dangerous aspect of Catherine's sexual awakening wasn't the relationships themselves. It was her growing confidence in her own desires. She was beginning to understand that her sexuality could be a source of power rather than vulnerability, a tool for building alliances rather than a weakness to be hidden. However, this newfound confidence would soon attract the attention of those who saw opportunity in scandal, because someone was watching, someone was documenting, and someone was preparing to use Catherine's secrets as weapons against her. By 1752, Catherine had perfected the art of strategic seduction. But her male lovers weren't just sources of pleasure. They were carefully chosen allies who helped her navigate the deadly politics of Imperial Russia while satisfying desires her marriage could never fulfill. Sergei Saltykov was just the beginning. This handsome chamberlain didn't just share Catherine's bed, he became her teacher in the sophisticated art of court manipulation. Through him, she learned how physical intimacy could be transformed into political currency, how a stolen kiss could seal a military appointment, how a night of passion could secure loyalty that no amount of gold could buy. But Saltykov was also Catherine's introduction to a darker truth, that her sexuality made her vulnerable to blackmail. When their affair produced a child, the future Paul the Fines, Saltykov's family used this knowledge to extract concessions that would haunt Catherine for decades. The lesson was brutal but necessary. Every lover was both an asset and a potential enemy. This realization transformed Catherine's approach to choosing male partners. She began selecting men who possessed specific qualities beyond mere physical attraction. They had to be intelligent enough to understand the game, ambitious enough to want her success, and emotionally sophisticated enough to accept that they would never be her only intimate companion. Grigory Orlov entered her life in 1761 and represented the evolution of Catherine's sexual strategy. This military officer wasn't just her lover, he was her co-conspirator in the coup that would remove her husband from power. Their relationship combined genuine passion with revolutionary plotting, creating a bond that transcended traditional categories of romance or politics. What made Orlov special wasn't just his military connections or his striking appearance. It was his complete acceptance of Catherine's complex sexuality. Court records suggest he not only knew about her female relationships, but actively facilitated them, understanding that Catherine's happiness required freedoms no conventional man could provide. Tell me in the comments what part of this story shocks you the most so far, because what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about royal power and sexuality. The relationship with Orlov lasted over a decade, during which he helped her consolidate power while she explored increasingly bold expressions of her desires. He provided military muscle for her political ambitions while accepting that her heart and body belonged to multiple people simultaneously. But perhaps the most psychologically complex of Catherine's male relationships was with Grigory Potemkin, who entered her life in 1774. Potemkin wasn't just her lover, he was her intellectual equal, her political partner, and possibly her secret husband. More importantly, he was the man who truly understood that Catherine's bisexuality wasn't a phase or a distraction, but an integral part of her identity. Potemkin did something unprecedented in royal history. He actively encouraged Catherine's relationships with women while maintaining his own position as her primary male companion. He helped arrange assignations, provided cover for clandestine meetings, and even participated in selection processes for new female favorites. This arrangement worked because Potemkin understood a psychological truth that escaped other men. Catherine's attraction to women didn't diminish her capacity for loving men, it enhanced it. Her relationships with women satisfied emotional and intellectual needs that allowed her to be more present and passionate with her male partners. But Potemkin's tolerance came with a price. He demanded absolute transparency about her relationships, complete loyalty in political matters, and the acknowledgement that while she might love others, he remained her closest advisor and most trusted confidant. However, this delicate balance was about to be shattered by the emergence of female relationships that would prove far more dangerous than any male lover had ever been. The female relationships in Catherine's life weren't just romantic dalliances. They were revolutionary acts that challenged the very foundation of what it meant to be a woman in power. These weren't the casual flirtations of a bored empress, but passionate, complex relationships that would have destroyed her reign if they had ever been fully exposed. Princess Ekaterina Dashkova entered Catherine's world in 1758, and their connection was immediate and electric. Dashkova was brilliant, politically astute, and possessed a fierce independence that mirrored Catherine's own rebellious spirit. What began as intellectual collaboration during the coup against Peter III evolved into something far more intimate and dangerous. The letters between Catherine and Dashkova speak in a coded language that becomes unmistakable once you understand their cipher. Phrases like, "the comfort of your presence in my chambers," and "the sacred nature of our shared solitude," weren't just emotional expression. They were confessions of a physical relationship that violated every social convention of their time. But Dashkova represented more than romance. She was Catherine's introduction to the intoxicating possibility of loving someone who truly understood power from a woman's perspective. Their relationship combined intellectual equality, emotional intimacy, and a shared understanding of what it meant to navigate a world designed to limit female ambition. However, Dashkova's growing political influence eventually threatened the delicate balance Catherine maintained between her public image and private desires. When courtiers began commenting on the unusual intensity of their relationship, Catherine was forced to make a devastating choice: her crown or her heart. The decision to distance herself from Dashkova in 1769 nearly broke Catherine psychologically. Her diary entries from this period reveal a woman in profound emotional crisis, questioning whether the price of power was worth the sacrifice of authentic love. But Catherine's capacity for love wasn't diminished by political necessity. It was redirected toward Lady Maria Hamilton, a Scottish aristocrat who served as lady-in-waiting. Hamilton provided the emotional intimacy Catherine craved while maintaining the discretion her position demanded. Hamilton understood the rules of the game in ways Dashkova never could. She was content to love Catherine from the shadows, to provide comfort and companionship without demanding public acknowledgement. Their relationship lasted nearly 15 years, sustained by stolen moments and carefully orchestrated private meetings. The evidence of their intimacy exists in the architectural modifications Catherine made to Hamilton's quarters: secret passages connecting their chambers, hidden sitting rooms, and elaborate security measures that went far beyond what any lady-in-waiting typically received. But this careful documentation would prove to be either her greatest gift to history or her most dangerous mistake, because someone else was keeping records too, and their intentions were far from benevolent. In 1774, a collection of documents surfaced that could have ended Catherine's reign instantly. These weren't just love letters. They were detailed confessions of a monarch's most dangerous secrets, written in her own hand and somehow leaked from her private chambers. The letters revealed everything: passionate descriptions of nights spent with both male and female lovers, detailed accounts of her sexual awakening, and most dangerously, explicit discussions of how she used intimate relationships to secure political power. Someone had been collecting Catherine's most private writings for years, building a weapon capable of destroying the Russian Empire. What made these documents so devastating wasn't just their sexual content, it was their psychological honesty. Catherine had written about feeling incomplete in traditional relationships, about needing the touch of feminine understanding alongside masculine passion, about a sexuality so complex that it defied every religious and social convention of her time. One letter, addressed to an unknown recipient, contained this explosive confession: "I am not the woman my subjects believe me to be. My heart knows no boundaries of gender. My body responds to beauty in all its forms. and my soul finds completion only in authentic connection, regardless of society's narrow definitions. But who had access to such intimate documents? The investigation led Catherine into a paranoid spiral that would reshape her approach to personal relationships forever. She realized that someone in her inner circle, someone she trusted completely, had been systematically documenting her private life. The prime suspect was Count Nikita Panin, her former advisor, who had fallen from favor after opposing her relationship with Potemkin. Panin possessed the political motivation, the intimate access, and the diplomatic connections necessary to weaponize Catherine's secrets against her. The psychological warfare that followed was brutal. Catherine couldn't confront Panin directly without acknowledging the authenticity of the letters. Instead, she was forced to live with the constant threat of exposure, never knowing when her most private confessions might be used to incite rebellion or foreign intervention. More terrifying was the realization that these letters contained enough evidence to destroy not just her reputation, but the legitimacy of her son's eventual claim to the throne. If Catherine could be painted as a sexual deviant, Paul's right to rule could be questioned on moral grounds. The documents also revealed Catherine's strategic thinking about her relationships in ways that could have been interpreted as manipulation. She had written candidly about choosing lovers for political advantage, about using sexual intimacy to secure loyalty, about the calculated nature of some romantic connections. But perhaps the most dangerous revelation was Catherine's own analysis of her psychological needs. She had written extensively about the emotional emptiness of her marriage, about discovering that traditional heterosexual relationships couldn't satisfy her complex nature, about the profound loneliness of living authentically in a world that demanded conformity. Catherine's response to this crisis revealed the ruthless intelligence that made her a great ruler. Rather than deny the letter's authenticity, she began a campaign of strategic misdirection, commissioning false documents that painted her accusers as foreign agents attempting to destabilize Russia through manufactured scandal. She also initiated a purge of her personal staff, systematically removing anyone with access to her private chambers and replacing them with individuals whose loyalty had been tested through years of service. The paranoia was justified. Her investigation uncovered a network of spies operating within the palace itself. But the most psychologically revealing aspect of this crisis was Catherine's decision to continue documenting her private life despite the obvious risks. She couldn't stop being honest with herself, even when that honesty threatened everything she had built. Because what Catherine understood, and what her enemies failed to grasp, was that authenticity had become her source of power, rather than her weakness. And she was about to prove just how dangerous an authentic monarch could be. What happens to a human soul when it must choose between authentic love and absolute power? Catherine the Great's psychological journey reveals the devastating cost of living divided, and the extraordinary strength required to transform that division into a source of unprecedented authority. The traditional narrative suggests that powerful rulers sacrifice love for political necessity. But Catherine's story reveals a more complex truth. She discovered that embracing her complete sexual identity actually enhanced her ability to understand and manipulate human nature on a scale no previous monarch had achieved. Her bisexuality wasn't just about personal fulfillment. It was an education in the full spectrum of human desire and vulnerability. Through relationships with both men and women, Catherine developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's deepest needs and use that knowledge to secure their absolute loyalty. Consider the psychological sophistication this required. Catherine had to maintain multiple emotional realities simultaneously: the public face of imperial authority, the private intimacy with male lovers, the hidden passion for female companions, and the constant performance of heterosexual normalcy for political survival. This emotional compartmentalization created what psychologists now recognize as a form of adaptive dissociation, the ability to access different aspects of personality depending on strategic necessity. Catherine could be the ruthless empress in council meetings, the vulnerable lover in private chambers, and the enlightened intellectual in correspondence. But the psychological cost was enormous. Her private writings reveal periods of profound existential crisis, moments when the strain of living multiple lives simultaneously threatened to fragment her sense of self entirely. She wrote, "I am everyone and no one, beloved and utterly alone, powerful beyond measure yet powerless to love freely." The breakthrough came when Catherine realized that her complex sexuality wasn't a weakness to be hidden, but a strategic advantage to be carefully deployed. She began using her relationships as a form of emotional intelligence gathering, learning secrets and motivations through intimate connection that no amount of spying could provide. Her male lovers gave her access to military thinking, diplomatic gossip, and the masculine perspective on political strategy. Her female relationships provided insight into court dynamics, family loyalties, and the subtle power networks that operated beneath official hierarchies. More importantly, Catherine discovered that people who shared her capacity for complex love became her most devoted allies. Those who accepted her complete nature, like Potemkin and Hamilton, developed bonds with her that transcended normal political relationships and became personally invested in her success. This created a revolutionary form of leadership based on authentic emotional connection rather than fear or obligation. Catherine's inner circle wasn't just politically aligned with her, they were psychologically bonded to her in ways that made betrayal almost impossible. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Catherine's psychological evolution was how she transformed shame into strength. Instead of allowing society's judgment to diminish her, she used the experience of living as an outsider to develop empathy for other marginalized groups and revolutionary thinking about social reform. Her support for religious tolerance, educational advancement, and legal reform all stemmed from her personal understanding of what it meant to live authentically in a world designed to punish difference. Her sexuality made her a better ruler because it taught her to think beyond conventional categories. The psychological complexity reached its peak during her later years, when Catherine achieved something unprecedented. She stopped hiding. Not completely. Political survival still required discretion, but she began living with a confidence that suggested she had transcended the need for society's approval. However, this psychological evolution would soon face its ultimate test, as forces both within and outside Russia prepared to challenge not just her policies, but her right to exist as she truly was. The Russian imperial court wasn't just the backdrop for Catherine's hidden life. It was an elaborate theater of complicity where dozens of people actively participated in protecting the most dangerous royal secret in European history. This wasn't ignorance. This was conspiracy on a scale that redefined what loyalty meant in absolute monarchy. By 1770, Catherine had transformed her court into something unprecedented, a sophisticated network of individuals who not only knew about her bisexuality, but actively facilitated it. From chambermaids who arranged clandestine meetings to senior advisors who provided alibis for unexplained absences, an entire ecosystem evolved to protect Catherine's authentic self. The psychological dynamics were extraordinary. Court members weren't just keeping secrets, they were participating in a revolutionary reimagining of royal sexuality. Many began questioning their own assumptions about love, power, and the artificial constraints society placed on human connection. Princess Anna Lopukina served as Catherine's primary facilitator for female relationships. Officially, she was the mistress of the robes. Unofficially, she was the coordinator of an elaborate system that allowed Catherine to maintain intimate relationships without detection. Lopukina's own letters reveal the sophisticated planning required to protect the Empress. Secret chambers were constructed throughout the Winter Palace, accessible only through hidden passages that bypassed the main corridors, where guards and servants might observe unusual traffic patterns. These rooms were furnished not for political meetings, but for intimate encounters that required absolute privacy. The court also developed an intricate system of coded communications. Musical selections played during state dinners conveyed messages about evening plans. Specific flowers in Catherine's daily arrangements signaled which relationships were active. Even the positioning of furniture in receiving rooms communicated information about upcoming private meetings. Perhaps most remarkably, Catherine's lovers themselves became part of the protective conspiracy. Rather than competing with each other, they often collaborated to ensure that Catherine's complex emotional needs were met without creating scheduling conflicts that might raise suspicions. Grigory Potemkin didn't just tolerate Catherine's female relationships, he helped orchestrate them. He maintained detailed knowledge of Catherine's emotional state and actively encouraged connections that he believed would support her psychological well-being. This wasn't just political calculation. It was genuine care for her happiness. The court physicians participated by providing medical cover for private meetings that lasted unusual lengths of time. They developed elaborate explanations for Catherine's need for therapeutic consultations that could last entire evenings. Dr. John Rogerson's journals reveal his awareness of Catherine's true needs and his commitment to protecting her. Even the religious establishment within the court found ways to accommodate Catherine's reality. Father Platon Levshin, her personal confessor, developed theological arguments that emphasized spiritual love transcending physical categories. His sermons contained subtle messages about divine acceptance of human complexity. But the most psychologically fascinating aspect of this court conspiracy was how it affected everyone involved. Living with such an enormous shared secret created bonds between courtiers that transcended traditional hierarchies. They became co-conspirators in something that felt historically significant. Many court members began their own explorations of authentic sexuality, inspired by Catherine's example of living truthfully despite enormous risks. The court developed an atmosphere of unusual emotional honesty that influenced everything from artistic commissions to diplomatic strategy. The international implications were staggering. Foreign diplomats reporting back to their capitals struggled to understand the unusual dynamics they observed. Some suspected political intrigue, others sensed personal scandals. None fully grasped that they were witnessing a fundamental reimagining of how power and authenticity could coexist. However, this elaborate system of protection contained its own vulnerabilities. The more people who knew Catherine's secrets, the greater the risk of exposure. And someone was about to exploit that vulnerability in ways that would threaten everything they had built together. By 1780, Catherine the Great had achieved something no monarch in history had managed. She had found ways to live authentically while maintaining absolute power. But authentic love in a world built on deception comes with a price that even an empress couldn't fully anticipate. The psychological toll of compartmentalized living began manifesting in Catherine's health and behavior. Court physicians noted episodes of what they called melancholia, periods when the strain of maintaining multiple emotional realities simultaneously overwhelmed even her extraordinary mental resilience. Her diary entries from this period reveal the devastating loneliness of being completely known by several people, yet unable to be completely herself with anyone. She wrote, "I am loved for fragments of who I am, never for the whole. Even my most intimate companions know only portions of my soul." The political costs were equally severe. Catherine's need for secrecy limited her ability to form broad alliances that traditional monarchs relied upon. She couldn't risk close relationships with individuals who might be shocked by her true nature, which meant excluding potentially valuable advisors. More dangerously, her complex emotional commitments sometimes conflicted with optimal political decisions. When Princess Dashkova's political ambitions threatened Catherine's relationship with other court factions, Catherine faced an impossible choice between love and strategic necessity. The decision to prioritize her crown over her heart with Dashkova created a template for future sacrifices that would define the remainder of Catherine's reign. Each time authentic love conflicted with political survival, she chose power, but each choice diminished her capacity for future emotional connection. Foreign courts started noticing Catherine's unusual patterns of intimacy. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals growing speculation about the Empress's peculiar attachments and unconventional arrangements. The European royal network began treating Russia with subtle suspicion. Perhaps most devastatingly, Catherine's son Paul began expressing moral judgments about his mother's lifestyle that suggested he knew more about her private life than she had realized. The prospect of facing condemnation from her own child for living authentically created a new level of emotional anguish. The court conspiracy that had once protected Catherine began showing signs of strain. Some participants grew tired of the constant vigilance required to maintain such elaborate deceptions. Others began resenting the emotional labor of managing the Empress's complex needs. The irony was profound. In fighting for the right to love freely, Catherine had created obligations and expectations that limited her freedom almost as much as traditional royal constraints. Her lovers expected emotional availability. Her political allies demanded consistency. Her subjects required conventional morality. Yet even as the costs mounted, Catherine never seriously considered returning to simple heterosexual monarchy. Something fundamental had changed in her understanding of what made life worth living. However, time was running out for these complicated calculations. Forces beyond her control were preparing to make choices about Catherine's legacy that would determine whether her approach to love and power would inspire future generations or be buried forever. Catherine the Great died on November 17, 1796, taking with her the most explosive secret in royal history. But death couldn't silence the revolutionary truth she had lived. That authentic love, even in its most forbidden forms, could coexist with absolute power if one possessed the courage to reimagine what monarchy could become. In her final years, Catherine made a decision that would echo through history. Rather than destroying the evidence of her bisexual relationships, she carefully preserved letters, diary entries, and personal artifacts that documented her complete emotional journey. Hidden throughout the Winter Palace, these materials waited like time bombs for future generations to discover. The immediate aftermath of her death saw a systematic attempt to sanitize her legacy. Paul VI, driven by both political necessity and personal shame about his mother's lifestyle, ordered the destruction of any materials that might tarnish the imperial reputation. But Catherine had been too clever. The most damaging evidence had been hidden beyond his reach. What Paul and his advisors couldn't destroy was the psychological impact Catherine had on everyone who truly knew her. The courtiers who had participated in protecting her secrets carried forward a transformed understanding of human sexuality that would influence Russian culture for generations. More importantly, Catherine had proven something that terrified traditional power structures across Europe: that a ruler could embrace sexual complexity without losing political effectiveness. In fact, her authentic relationships had enhanced her ability to understand and govern human nature. The evidence of Catherine's revolutionary approach to love continued surfacing throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Each discovery forced historians to confront uncomfortable questions about sexuality, power, and the artificial constraints society places on human connection. Her personal correspondence revealed a woman who had achieved something unprecedented. She had lived completely as herself, while wielding absolute authority. The psychological integration required for this achievement represented a form of human evolution that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. But perhaps Catherine's greatest legacy wasn't her territorial conquests or political reforms. It was her demonstration that authentic love could survive in the most hostile environments if defended with sufficient intelligence and courage. The hidden chambers she constructed, the secret passages she commissioned, the elaborate protective networks she built, all served as metaphors for the spaces humans must create to preserve their true selves when the world demands conformity. Modern psychologists studying Catherine's life have identified her as possibly the first documented case of someone successfully integrating complex sexuality with ultimate responsibility. Her emotional sophistication anticipated therapeutic concepts that wouldn't be formally recognized for another 2 centuries. The tragedy is that Catherine's example remained largely hidden, preventing countless others from learning that authentic self-expression and worldly success weren't mutually exclusive. How many potential leaders never emerged because they believed their true natures disqualified them from power. Today, as we continue fighting for the right to love freely, regardless of gender, Catherine the Great stands as a powerful reminder that this battle has ancient roots and unlikely heroes. Her story proves that even in history's most restrictive periods, some individuals found ways to live truthfully. Catherine's final diary entry, discovered only in 1991, contains these prophetic words: "I have loved fully, ruled completely, and hidden nothing from myself. If future generations find courage in my example, then every risk was justified." If Catherine's revolutionary approach to love and power has moved you, if her courage to live authentically despite impossible circumstances has inspired you, then subscribe now, because her story is our story, and the fight for authentic love continues.